according to the new report. The average temperature will be 1.8 degrees warmer compared to 1991 to 2020. The number of 100-degree days will nearly double again, comparing 2001 to 2020. Extreme rainfall intensity will increase by about 2 to 3%, comparing 2001 to 2020, and urban flooding will increase by about 10 to 15%, compared to what was expected for 2000 to 2018. This was written up in the Houston Chronicle. Given the changes we've already seen and the changes to come, what can we do to avoid the heightened impact on the most vulnerable among us? And what can we do to advocate for every Texan? Our panelists today are Katharine Hayhoe and Dr. Robert Bullard. Dr. Katharine Hayhoe is an accomplished atmospheric scientist and an author of the federal government's National Climate Assessment, and someone who has conveyed the reality of climate change to millions of people. She received the American Geophysical Union's Climate Communications Prize, the Stephen Schneider Climate Communication Award, and the United Nations Champion of the Earth Award. Her TED Talk, The Most Important Thing You Can Do to Fight Climate Change, Talk About It, has nearly 4 million views, and her most recent book, Saving Us, A Climate Scientist's Case for Hope and Healing in a Divided World, was just published by Simon & Schuster. And it's amazing. Dr. Robert Bullard is a distinguished professor of urban planning and environmental policy at Texas Southern University and founding director of the Bullard Center for Environmental and Climate Justice. He received his PhD from Iowa State University and is often called the father of environmental justice. Professor Bullard is co-founder of the HBCU Climate Change Consortium and the National Black Environmental Justice Network. He's the author of 18 books. Like Dr. Hayhoe, he is a recipient of the Stephen H. Schneider Award for Outstanding Climate Science Communication. Thank you both for being here today. I understand that I'd like you to start with a brief introduction to how your work hits Texas. Dr. Hayhoe?
I'm a climate scientist, and I study what climate change means to us in the places where we live. Here in Texas, we already have award-winning certified wild weather, but climate change is loading the weather dice against us, making our weather more extreme and even more damaging. In fact, Texas is arguably the most vulnerable state in the whole country to climate impacts. Why do we care? Because they affect every aspect of our lives. They affect our agriculture. They affect the air we breathe. They affect the integrity of our homes and our cities. And they exacerbate crises like justice, which is what we're here to talk about today.
Dr. Bullard.
Well, thanks for having me on this panel. I'm a sociologist by training, and I'm an environmental sociologist. And for the last 4 decades, I've been working on issues that intersect with health, housing, transportation, energy, issues around who gets protected and who gets left behind. And I think climate change will exacerbate so many vulnerabilities, so many inequities. And so what I've tried to do is to connect the dots. And the dots are very clear. And it's more than talking about something in the future in terms of climate. It's with us right now and at ground zero in low-income communities and communities of color and in marginalized communities. We can see it in living color, and it's not pretty. Mm-hmm. And so I think it's important that we talk about climate change as more than parts per million in greenhouse gases. It's also about justice, mm-hmm. fairness, equity, and vulnerability.
Absolutely. Dr. Hayhoe, how do we know that climate change is real and that human activity is causing it? It really shouldn't have to be asked at this point, but after the last 5 years, I'm taking no chances.
You're perfectly right, John, because unfortunately, even though scientists have known about this since the 1800s, we get so much misinformation and disinformation in the media today, we don't know who to believe. So here's how we know the planet is warming. It isn't only all of our thousands of thermometers around the world. It's not only the satellites and the ocean instruments we have that track the warming of this planet. When you look at what I call natural indicators, so when trees are blooming, how quickly glaciers are melting, sea levels rising, species are moving poleward, There are over 26,500 independent lines of evidence, some of them literally in our own backyards here in Texas, showing us that, yes, the planet is warming. Just one example, a colleague of mine is a biologist here at Texas Tech University. When he moved here 30 years ago, he planted a peach tree in his backyard. And being a biologist, he wrote the day down that peach tree flowered every year until he had to cut it down just a few years ago. And when he had to cut it down, it was flowering 2 to 3 weeks earlier in the year than when he planted it 30 years ago. That's how quickly things have changed. Where I live in Lubbock, Texas, the climate is now like Austin was just 25 years ago. Unfortunately, the music and the food didn't come, just the climate. How do we know it's humans? It's because we've examined every other aspect of this natural world that can cause climate to change. We know, we scientists are the ones who study this, that it's been warmer before. We know that there are natural cycles and orbital cycles, volcanic eruptions, and changes in the sun's energy. And we go through every single one of those natural suspects before we see if it might be humans. And when we do that, we see, no, according to natural factors, we should be getting cooler right now, not warmer. The only reason we're warming is because we humans have been digging up massive amounts of coal, oil, and gas, burning it, which produces huge amounts of air pollution that are responsible for almost 9 million premature deaths every year. But also burning fossil fuels produces heat-trapping gases like carbon dioxide that are building up in the atmosphere, wrapping an extra blanket around the planet. And that's what's causing the planet to warm.
And while I introduced this question by saying we shouldn't have to discuss this now, really, most people have gotten the message, right? Could you talk about that and for instance, what the Yale Program on Climate Change Communications polling shows about how many people really actually don't believe climate change is real?
So new results from the Yale Program on Climate Communication just a few weeks ago showed that 70% of us across the whole US are already worried about climate change. 70%. And here in Texas, people might not want to call it climate change, but they understand it is getting weirder. We can see it wherever we live. We could be in San Antonio, Dallas, Houston, Lubbock, Austin. We can see the weather getting weirder. Here's the problem, though. 50% of us feel helpless and hopeless. When it comes to climate action, we don't know what to do. And only 35% of us understand that it even affects us personally. We still think it's an issue for the future, for people who live far away, for plants and animals, but not for me. The reality is climate change is already here, and it's already now, and it is already affecting every single one of us living in Texas, but it is not fair. It affects the most marginalized and most vulnerable people more. It affects women and children more than men. It affects people who are disabled more than those who are able. It affects people who are already living in low-income neighborhoods that are more prone to flooding, that are exposed to poor air quality. And here in Texas, most of those neighborhoods are Black or brown neighborhoods. So people who are already struggling, people who are already trying to just make ends meet to get by and feed their family, they are the ones who are most affected by climate change right here in Texas, as well as on the other side of the world.
Dr. Bullard, let's carry that idea further. How many people, how do we show that the impact of these changes doesn't hit everyone the same? What have you seen, and how can we discuss it and describe it?
Well, it's important for people to understand that America is segregated, and so is pollution. America is segregated, and so are the disproportionate impact where they fall. So when we talk about the issues of climate change and how climate change will exacerbate existing vulnerabilities and existing disparities. If you look at land use, zoning, and where communities provide with protection in terms of mitigation, in terms of who's living behind the levee, who has all kinds of green canopy, trees, parks, et cetera, we can look at studies that were done 100 years ago that looked at racial redlining and which neighborhoods were provided amenities that were considered middle-class amenities going in housing, whether it was parks, trees, green canopy, landscape, etc. Which communities were, because of racism in housing, were relegated to low-lying areas, areas that were prone to flood, areas that did not get the kinds of flood mitigation and protection. We can see the results of that racial footprint or fingerprint from the 1920s to the 2020s. And when we're talking about climate change is going to make it hotter, wetter, and more dangerous when it comes to pollution, the communities that were redlined, that put the locally unwanted land uses and the things that other people don't want, the externalities that push them in those areas, climate change will exacerbate that and will make it more difficult. So climate change is not just an environmental issue, it's also a health issue, an energy issue, a transportation issue, an issue when it comes to food and water security. When we lose power, that means that, you know, a middle-class family losing power that may have a generator out back or may have resilience, a bank account, they can go credit card, drive in their car, go live in a hotel for whatever. But if you talk about economic vulnerability, climate change will see that inequality play out in real numbers. Living in the Gulf Coast, living in Texas, we used to plan for disasters June through November, but not anymore. We have to do it year round because Winter Storm Uri hit us in when? February. So, and again, that winter storm fingerprint was much more disturbing and lasting and harder in those same communities that are inundated with refineries, chemical plants, pollution, that are underwater because of flooding, and the same communities are still trying to bounce back from the winter storm. That's why we see it, and if you're in those communities at ground zero, they're not talking about something 20 years from now. They're talking about right now, one storm after another storm after another storm. That's the reality of living in Texas and where I am in Houston.
And you and I have talked in the past about when Hurricane Laura came to Louisiana. We talked about the fact that, yes, a hurricane hits the whole region. It doesn't, you know, there will be suffering in the more well-off, in the white population. But that still means, you know, just because one group suffers, that disparity is still there. Can you talk about that a little bit? Because I sometimes hear people say, well, wait, everybody gets hit by a hurricane.
Yeah. If you go, you know, I think Katrina was the wake up for the disparate impact. Who's on the rooftops? And if you are driving a Mercedes, you're most likely not to be on the rooftop. So when you talk about 80% of New Orleans drowned with Katrina, or you talk about some of the other storms, vulnerability maps closely with the whole idea of resilience. And when you talk about your zip code being a pretty good predictor of health and well-being, zip code can also be a pretty good predictor of which neighborhoods have insurance, which residents, households have insurance, regular homeowners insurance, as well as flood insurance, and which communities are more likely not just flood during major severe weather events, but flood during rainstorms. East side, Houston. So when we talk about these issues, we can fingerprint what's happening over, you know, the last, 50 years, 100 years. But Houston got hit, in the last 3-4 years with 500-year storms. So it's like, okay, Tax Day flood, Memorial Day flood, and then Harvey. There are people still trying to bounce back from Tax Day, Memorial, and then Harvey hits. There's people still trying to bounce back from Harvey, and then Uri hit, and then Nicholas. So the pain and suffering is not really distributed in a way that's equal across the board. And a lot of it, the vulnerability can be traced back to other structural inequality and housing discrimination and residential segregation and racial redlining. It's real, and you can map that with the technology, GIS, and other kinds of mapping. that you can just overlay one after the other after the other. It's the same map. It's the same.
And we've talked about flooding, especially because these neighborhoods are so hard hit. And I'd love either of you or both of you to talk about this. The climate impact of heat is also especially tied to things like the redlining. These neighborhoods, as you were saying, they didn't get the trees, they didn't get the parks, and so the urban heat effect is right there. Can we talk about how that plays out in people's lives and especially their health?
Let me just jump on that, because as a matter of fact, I did an interview the other day with the Houston Chronicle, and we were working with communities in Fifth Ward, for example. This is a neighborhood that was redlined, it's prone to flooding, lots of pollution, and then you get COVID. You start getting a piling on effect. And when you talk about heat plus pollution, in terms of bad health outcomes, especially for women, pregnant women. So you're talking about intergenerational. You're talking about things that will disproportionately impact a population and children that are yet to be born. So this is about a justice issue that's much larger than whether or not you have trees in a grocery store. But those things also go into play, whether or not you can be a much more resilient community and be able to bounce back and fend off all these different stressors and threats that are converging. And they're coming at those communities, and it's like a heat-seeking missile and a bullseye. Unfortunately, that bullseye is the most vulnerable part of our cities and communities.
Dr. Hayhoe, how about you?
Yeah, so let me just explain what the urban heat island effect is for people. It was actually discovered by a medical professional, a doctor who lived outside of London, England in the 1830s. And he would drive into the city every day to work, and he would notice how much warmer it was in the city than out in rural areas where it had lots of green space and trees. It turns out that because cities have so much concrete and dark surfaces, they trap a lot more heat. But within a city, the richer neighborhoods that have more trees, more parks, more green space, they can be about 3 or 4 degrees cooler on average than the lower income neighborhoods that were historically redlined, as Dr. Bullard explained. But during a heat wave, those neighborhoods can be 15 degrees Fahrenheit hotter if they don't have the trees, the shade, the green spaces. Not only that, but trees clean the air. They can take out about 1/3 of all the particulates that we breathe in that can cause everything from asthma to heart disease. And so there are serious health consequences to living in areas that just have concrete, no trees, just soaking up all that heat and allowing all that pollution to just, get in the air that we breathe unfiltered. I want to tell you the story of one of my colleagues, Patricia Solis. She's at Texas Tech, but also at Arizona State University. She studies heat-related illnesses and deaths. So she was collecting the data from the city of Phoenix, where Arizona State University is, collecting the data on the really crazy heat waves that they've had recently in the past couple of years, and looking at where those people lived. One huge block was dark red, an entire block. And she thought to herself, that just must be an accident in the data, because normally you see, different colors around, but why would a whole block be red? And then she was driving to the university using her Google Maps because she wasn't very familiar with Phoenix. And as she was driving along, she's like, that's that huge red block. It is 100% mobile homes. It is just concrete, no trees, no grass. All mobile homes that are not owned by the people who live in them. They might own the mobile home itself, but they don't own the property, so they can't put trees in. And mobile homes are terrible to try to insulate. They often can't afford to pay their air conditioning bill when temperatures soar. And so the mortality rates, mortality is a fancy science word for death. The death rates there were just off the charts because of the way people lived, and they didn't have any choices. And in Phoenix, if people lived in low-income housing, they actually were able to have access to government loans to help protect them during heat waves. But if they lived in a mobile home, they were not eligible for those loans. There was a huge crack in the system, and those people were falling right into it.
Well, let's focus on Texas again. Dr. Bullard, when we've spoken in the past, especially about Laura, we talked about the fact that Lake Charles, these stronger hurricanes are coming in, and not only are they bringing tremendous amounts of water, but very often they've got a lot of power and the wind behind them. And there were petrochemical plants that just weren't up to the challenge of this kind of storm. And you and I talked about Lake Charles and the fence line communities around Lake Charles. This is sort of a bank shot of climate change and environmental racism. But I hope you'll talk about that with regard to Port Arthur, Houston, our places in Texas where you've got those same vulnerabilities. What can we say about that? Yeah,
it is no accident that the most vulnerable places that you mentioned, whether it's the Houston Ship Channel and neighborhoods like Manchester, or in Port Arthur, West Port Arthur, or down in Corpus with the Refinery Road neighborhoods, Black and Brown, or you go to Lake Charles, and you'll see that same pattern in terms of fence line. Who's on the fence line? Who's driving in 8 hours, drive out, and leave the neighborhood? The workers. Workers generally are not at the fence line. People on the fence line are getting polluted, they're getting sick, and they're getting to remain impoverished. So poverty, pollution, and bad health. And what happens is that these storms that come through, they leave a lot of water and rain, and oftentimes the attention is on the flooding, but it's also the pollution that ends up in people's homes, and their homes are flooded, so it's water pollution and all kinds of stuff that's in the water. But it's also in the startups and shutdowns of these refineries and plants, and ended up with lots of pollution being released. Just like if you mow your grass and use a lawnmower that runs on gasoline, when you start it, it puts out stuff. And that's the kind of you multiply that by a factor of how many, and that's what they get. They get pollution, they get the flooding, and they get displaced, because oftentimes these floods now are going back to back to back 3 years in a row, and some folks are still trying to bounce back from Ida and then Nicholas, and then you start going back 2 years ago. There are blue tarp on people's houses from 3 seasons ago. And so again, that's that equity or inequity imbalance that I'm talking about, in terms of the extent to which homeowners are able to get their insurance settlements, if they have insurance, or to get access to FEMA recovery dollars. And there's a disparity in the way that FEMA sends money down to disaster areas. And there's an economic overlay, and there's a racial overlay. Affluent white homeowners tend to get a lion's share of the monies as damages recovery. And I call that money follows money, money follows power, money follows whites. As a matter of fact, FEMA's own 2020 study showed that they're leaving behind the most vulnerable in terms of hard-hit, marginalized homeowners. And when you talk about this whole question of how this fingerprint in Texas, you can see money, the communities that got hit the hardest, like Harris County, Houston. And when the money comes to the state, the money stops at the state and somehow does not get distributed, Harvey recovery dollars, to the places that got hit the hardest, like Houston, Harris County. That's where we have to talk about justice, fairness, and equity, and not just allow cost-benefit analysis and so-called market forces to drive resources to areas that were hard hit. We need another layer, a lens, that equity lens. And right now, FEMA, on the new administration, is now using an additional metric in addition to cost-benefit analysis, the CDC, Center for Disease Control and Prevention's Social Vulnerability Index, which brings into that lens of poverty, lack of having resources, insurance, communities that get hit over and over and over again, areas where that are prone to these disasters in terms of damages. When you add that social vulnerability index to the more traditional measure, you're more likely to get FEMA and other recovery dollars following need, as opposed to that other where communities still get left out, still are trying to recover and bounce back from a storm from Hurricane Ike. So that's the kind of realities that a lot of ground zero communities that are living the climate injustice and have been living the environmental pollution injustice for decades. That needs to end.
When you see that the tarps are actually starting to fade, you know people have been waiting too long. Dr. Hayhoe, I think you were about to say something.
Yes, and I was just going to say, some things you can bounce back from and build back from, but some things you can't. And Dr. Bullard mentioned the Manchester neighborhood by the Houston Ship Channel. A study came out just this year, 2.5 years after Harvey, showing that people there were exposed to some carcinogens, those pollutants that cause cancer. Some people were exposed to a lifetime level of those pollutions in just a matter of days due to the flooding due to Harvey. You do not bounce back from that.
Yeah. So let's talk just a bit about the freeze and Uri. Dr. Hayhoe, that is still the question of whether the polar vortex effect can be linked directly to climate change. That's still a little bit in scientific debate, right? Unlike climate change, there are people who are a little reluctant to call that one. Am I right about that?
Well, that's emerging very quickly, John, because the field of individual event attribution, where we look at specific events and we try to figure out what are the mechanisms by which climate change could affect them, that field is growing so quickly that I can barely keep up with it. So, and I'm a scientist and I read these papers every day. So a few weeks ago, the first study did come out, I think actually it was back in August, showing that because the Arctic is warming twice as fast as the rest of the world, and we've known that since the 1800s, because the Arctic is warming so quickly, it is affecting the polar vortex, causing it to stretch more. And when it stretches, that's the precursor to the big outbreaks like we just saw last February in Texas. You get a big stretch of the polar vortex, and then the jet stream starts to wiggle like this. And before you know it, it wiggles all the way down to Texas. It's like opening the freezer door, and that cold air from the Arctic just pours all the way straight down to us. So that study already came out in August showing that climate change is increasing the risk of that freezer door swinging open. And then another study just came out very recently showing that there's two different mechanisms, not just one, but two mechanisms that causes an Arctic the warming Arctic to increase the risk of these crazy cold air outbreaks. So in between those outbreaks, it's getting warmer and warmer and warmer. But then the freezer door swings open and all that cold air just pours all the way down to us. And the risk of that happening is also increasing, which is why I think a better name for this whole thing is global weirding, not warming, because it is just getting weirder. And I know you like that too, because you've written about that too, John, haven't you?
Yeah. Yes, I have. And you're talking about the Judah Cohen paper. Am I right?
That was the first one, but there was a second one that just came out.
It's a really fascinating, evolving area of science, and I like you. I think they're really going to show that there is an effect. But and again, we're seeing the same type of inequity. People who can't get away, just as with a hurricane, you can't just hop on a plane to Cancun.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was cold.
I'm sorry. So what can we do as a nation to address these inequities, the ones we've been talking about?
Well, let me just say this. I think it's important that we have to acknowledge that there is a crisis, and that the science and the data and the information that we have right now, we have enough information to move on policy. And I think we have to recognize and acknowledge that this crisis is not impacting everybody the same. And so we have to plan for addressing those vulnerabilities in a very comprehensive way. And as we transition to a green, clean energy economy, we have to make sure that we don't leave behind, like we left behind during the oil and gas economy, those populations. We have to talk about our transportation, our housing, the way that we plan our cities and deal with cities and metropolitan areas. We have to make sure that we are looking at mental health as well as health in terms of climate, and deal with this in a realistic way in terms of our infrastructure investments, hard infrastructure as well as soft organization, safety nets, all those things. That's being debated right now. And realistically, I think Texas is going to have to step up because, as you said, we are one of those number ones where we really don't want to be number one or don't need to be number one, but we need to come out fast and furious in leading on trying to come up with more, I guess, just, sustainable, climate resilient plans and invest in it as if our lives depended on it, because it does.
And the city of Houston has a climate action plan led by the mayor, which looks exactly at these issues of urban heat, of flooding, of resilience, of vulnerability. And in many ways, Houston, building on the work of Dr. Bullard for many, many decades, is finally taking this issue seriously and recognizing that there are things we can do at the city level, as well as obviously there is much to do at the level of the state and the whole country, but there's much that can be done at the city level that directly addresses people, populations, and neighborhoods. I'm also the chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy now, as of June. John and I, we both, swap jobs in the summer. And one of their projects is not in Texas, but it's something that could be done very easily in Texas. It's called the Green Heart Project. It's in Louisville, Kentucky. And it is all about re-greening some of those historically redlined neighborhoods to improve people's physical health, to improve their mental health, to improve the quality of the air they breathe, to reduce the urban heat island effect, and to reduce flooding as well, because it offers more spaces for that water to sink in. And so there are things that we can do today that make a difference. Oh, and by the way, those trees also take up carbon and help with climate change. But it's like you've got 10 benefits lined up right away. Oh, and then climate change too. So the real question is, why are we not doing these? Because these solutions help us all.
And then, so that's what government can do. What can we do as citizens to help move this along? What's our job in all of this?
Well, let me just take a shot at that, because I work with communities on the ground, have been doing this for like 40 plus years. And I'm seeing so much coming out right now in terms of on the front burner. And, in the 70s, late 70s, when I got started in Houston working on these issues, it was more of a footnote. Today, it's a headline. And I think having foundations, private foundations invest in organizations, in infrastructure, in terms of non-governmental organizations, nonprofits, community university partnerships. I'm at Texas Southern University, and we have lots of partnerships with community organizations in Houston and in Texas and along the Gulf Coast. And these partnerships are real resources to communities on a range of issues that we've been discussing. And in some cases, the communities themselves have been provided with resources to build that capacity to be in those rooms with government officials, with planners, with corporations that are talking about moving to green, et cetera. That's how we get change, transformative change. The government can only do so much. And I think a lot of the work and the push is coming from the outside. I serve on the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. There are 26 of us on that council. There are 3 of us from Texas. Juan Paras from Tejas here in Houston, and Susana Almanza from Poder in Austin, and myself here in Houston. And we are pushing the federal government, but we also pushing our state and our city governments to do what we see needs to happen quickly, because we don't have 40 years to get it right. We have maybe a decade and a half or so. But again, I think it's the urgency of now is right, is the flag that we're flying, the urgency of now.
Mm-hmm. I love that.
Yeah, it's great.
And just boiling it all down. And this is what I always say, and this is what my TED Talk was about, and this is what my new book, Saving Us, is about. But what it's all about is every single one of us, have the most powerful tool that is the only thing that's ever changed the world before, and that tool is our voice. Using our voices to advocate for change is how the world has changed and how it must change again. And every single one of us has a voice. And today, it's our youngest people who are showing us how to use our voice most effectively.
It's tremendous. And when people say, when lawmakers say especially, that the costs of action are too high, when they say, "Oh, that trillion, that we can't do that, we can't afford that number of billions of dollars," how, as citizens concerned about climate change, do we best respond to that?
Well, I will tell you that the cost of climate change within the next 3 decades will easily top $9 trillion if we don't fix it. Not to mention, how do you put a dollar sign on literally, again, the nearly 2 million people around the world, or 2 million premature births and 9 million people around the world who die prematurely due to fossil fuel air pollution? We have an economic system that is not valuing everything. It is valuing this much. Our economic system does not value the resources that go into it. It does not value the pollution or waste that comes out of it. And our economic system does not value human life. That's why we need what many people call a circular economy, where we truly understand that we don't live on a planet that is in effect infinite and flat. We've been acting as if our planet is infinite and flat, as if there are always more resources to get, more land, more water, and when we produce pollution, it just sort of mysteriously disappears. That we've been living on an imaginary flat Earth for decades and centuries, and it's time to realize, wake up, our Earth is round, it is limited, we already have 8 billion of us on this planet, and we need to value every single thing that we take from and return from this Earth, including the value of life.
Well, Dr. Bullard, I'm going to give you the last word, if that's all right.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think investing in our future, and particularly making those investments that will pay off in the long run, because we have neglected so much. We have destroyed so much. And so if we can see, beyond, 4 years and look to how we need to respond to this crisis with funding that's commensurate with what's needed, and not penny pinch, and the fact that we have fought all these wars and wasted so much money, and at the same time we have neglected our physical infrastructure, and we've neglected our social infrastructure, our safety nets, our schools, parks and green space, things that make us healthy. And in terms of addressing inequality, which is widened by climate change, we have to arrest this inequality so that we will be able to live up to that North Star and justice for all. And that's where I think, the environmental justice and climate justice framework is so powerful when we talk about addressing this crisis.
This is tremendous. I thank both of you for this fantastic conversation. It's great to talk with both of you again. And I hope everyone has a good rest of their day. Thank you so much.
Thank you, John.
Thanks a lot, John.
Martin Luther King once said, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." It bends towards justice. As I reflect on what we've learned thus far, one takeaway is that the universe will not bend by itself. It requires all of us to question unemotionally with data, challenge conventional wisdom, learn deeply and broadly considering all intersectionality, and become actively involved to essentially be the change. As you reflect on what you've learned regarding economic equity and environmental injustices, my belief and my hope is that we all have a clear call to action. And I also hope that you will join our community of SVP partners, corporate sponsors, philanthropic, and other supporters as we advance this critically important and worthwhile mission in Greater Dallas. I am truly looking forward to seeing all of you at Paul Quinn College tomorrow for the in-person part of our program. Please take time this afternoon to visit bigbangtx.com for a detailed agenda and a roster of the amazing speakers and content that we will be covering tomorrow face-to-face. And as we get close to adjourning our virtual program, I wanted to revisit a couple of tactical items with you today. The first is that the recordings of all the virtual sessions will be available in Hublot for the next 30 days or so. And so I would encourage you to take time to revisit that content as you reflect and define your all call to action moving forward. And then the second tactical thing is related to Paul Quinn tomorrow. Please make sure to follow all COVID protocols, including presenting your vaccination card, and planning to wear masks whenever appropriate during the in-person part of our program. I want to finally recognize everyone who has been involved in putting this program together thus far. It's been quite a lot of work and commitment. I want to thank all of you for hanging in with us for the last 3 days. Many great comments and questions, and clearly illustrates your engagement. And finally, I want to say again, thank you for your support of SVP Dallas and our mission. I will hopefully see you tomorrow. And again, to quote our esteemed CEO, Tony Fleo, do good better. Thank you.